December 1939. Deep within the unforgiving expanse of the Finnish wilderness, where the taiga clawed at a sky the color of lead, a Red Army patrol pushed forward. 15 men strong, their breath plumed like ghostly signals in the brutal -40 degrees Celsius air, each crunch of their boots on the virgin snow echoing with an almost unnatural clarity in the profound silence. These were hardened men, soldiers of the Soviet Union, heirs to a revolutionary legacy, and they marched with the grim confidence born of overwhelming numbers. Their vast nation had mobilized against a smaller, seemingly insignificant adversary, and the expectation in Moscow and among these men was a swift, decisive victory. Yet this desolate landscape was a deception. The snow, thick and pristine, offered no warmth, only an infinite, blinding white. The towering pines, draped in their heavy winter cloaks, obscured all but the immediate few meters, transforming the forest into a labyrinth of shadows and frigid air. Visibility was a luxury, constantly stolen by the swirling snow dust and the frosted edges of their own balaclavas. It was precisely into this environmental crucible, where every sensory input was muted or distorted, that the patrol ventured. They were not merely traversing terrain. They were entering an arena custom-built for an unseen predator. Suddenly, a sharp, almost imperceptible crack tore through the icy stillness. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a whisper of death carried on the wind. One moment, Private Ivan Petrov, numbly adjusting his PPSH-41 submachine gun, was scanning the tree line. The next, he simply collapsed, a crimson bloom appearing stark against the white of his uniform, already freezing solid. No shout, no warning, only the guttural gasp of the man behind him. Before the patrol leader could even bellow an order, another crack, another man down. The initial confidence, so palpable moments before, dissolved into a raw, primal terror. There was no enemy to see, no muzzle flash to target, no discernible direction from which this silent, surgical death emanated. Only the chilling realization that they were being hunted, one, by an invisible force that understood this frozen hell far better than they did. Yet the raw primal terror that gripped Soviet patrols in the Karelian Isthmus was a stark, brutal contrast to the strategic calculations being made mere weeks prior, hundreds of kilometers to the east. By November 1939, the geopolitical chessboard had been dramatically reshaped by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly carved up Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. For Joseph Stalin, securing the Baltic states and expanding the Soviet Union's western frontier was a paramount objective, and Finland, a small, independent nation, represented the next logical piece of this territorial expansion. The prevailing mindset within the Kremlin, emboldened by Stalin's absolute certainty, was one of overwhelming confidence. Finland, with its modest military and agrarian economy, was regarded as an insignificant adversary, a mere speed bump on the path to Soviet hegemony. The Red Army, fresh from its virtually unopposed occupation of eastern Poland, was a colossal mechanized force. It boasted an initial invasion strength of over 450,000 troops, deployed across 4 armies, supported by approximately 2,500 to 3,000 tanks and an equivalent number of artillery pieces. This quantitative superiority, bordering on the absurd, was designed to simply roll over any resistance. Soviet military doctrine, rigid and steeped in the principles of massed frontal assaults and deep penetration, was predicated on the assumption that sheer numbers and overwhelming firepower would inevitably crush any opposition. There was little to no contingency for unconventional warfare, for an enemy that did not fight on open plains, or for terrain that actively conspired against heavy armor and logistical supply lines. Their intelligence assessments of Finnish defensive capabilities, particularly the famed Mannerheim line, were laughably dismissive, often describing it as an improvised, easily breached fortification. This profound underestimation was not merely a tactical blunder, it was an ideological one. The Soviet High Command failed to grasp the formidable Sisu, the Finnish concept of grit, resilience, and unyielding determination that permeated their adversary's spirit. They utterly failed to appreciate the brutal, unforgiving nature of the Finnish winter landscape itself, the impenetrable taiga forests, the labyrinthine frozen lakes, and the deep, energy-sapping snow that would transform every advance into a logistical nightmare. The Red Army was prepared for a parade to Helsinki. Instead, they were about to enter a frozen, white hell where the very environment would become a weapon in the hands of an underestimated foe. Yet, to grasp the true horror inflicted upon the Red Army and the sheer audacity of this unseen nemesis, one must first understand the battlefield itself and the indomitable spirit of the nation that birthed such defiance. Finland, a small Nordic nation clinging to the eastern edge of Scandinavia, possessed a population of only 3.7 million citizens. This modest figure stood in stark, almost unfathomable contrast to the Soviet Union's more than 170 million people, a colossus boasting an industrial might designed to overwhelm. The disparity was not merely demographic, it was strategic. The Red Army invaded with an overwhelming numerical superiority, an advantage of 4-to-1 in troops, 30-to-1 in aircraft, and a staggering 100-to-1 in tanks. Against such a behemoth, any conventional defense seemed futile. However, Finland possessed an intangible yet profoundly potent weapon, Sisu. Untranslatable into English, Sisu embodies an extraordinary blend of grit, resilience, and unwavering courage. It is a deep-seated stoicism, a tenacious defiance of overwhelming odds that compels an individual to act heroically in moments when reason dictates surrender. It is the unyielding resolve to continue fighting even when all hope appears lost, a force born of their austere landscape and a history of hard-won independence. This Sisu was not merely an abstract concept, it was a practical doctrine. It manifested in their intimate knowledge of their brutal snow-laden forests, their mastery of skiing, and their ability to thrive in temperatures that plunged far below zero. The Finnish people, predominantly farmers, lumberjacks, and hunters, were inherently connected to their land, understanding its every nuance, its every treacherous crevice and hidden path. For them, this was not merely a territorial dispute, it was an existential struggle for their very identity, their homes, and their way of life. They were David facing a Soviet Goliath, but this David knew his sling and he knew his terrain, transforming the inhospitable wilderness into a fortress against the invading tide. Yet, beyond the conventional calculus of divisions and firepower, the true, silent protagonist of the Winter War was the environment itself. Finland, a land forged by ice and endless forest, presented a battlefield unlike any other. Here, nature wielded an icy hammer far more devastating than any artillery barrage. Temperatures routinely plummeted to an unimaginable -40 degrees Celsius, transforming the very air into a weapon. Snowdrifts piled meters deep, swallowing roads and rendering mechanized movement a torturous, often impossible endeavor. Dense conifer forests, stark and unforgiving, stretched for hundreds of kilometers, creating a labyrinth of shadows and blinding white. Frozen lakes, seemingly innocuous, became treacherous passages or exposed killing fields. The Soviet Red Army, by stark contrast, entered this realm fatally unprepared. Their logistics, designed for the vast open plains of Eastern Europe, utterly collapsed in the Finnish wilderness. Thousands of conscripts, many from warmer southern regions, were issued thin, drab uniforms, offering scant protection against the biting cold. Frostbite became as ubiquitous and lethal as enemy bullets, gnawing at fingers, toes, and faces. Their heavy tanks and trucks, designed to punch through lines, became bogged down in the deep snow, transforming into immobile, frigid tombs. Disorientation was profound. Maps were useless in a landscape where every tree, every snowdrift looked identical to the unfamiliar eye. What began as a military invasion quickly devolved into a desperate struggle for basic survival against an enemy that wasn't just armed men, but the very breath of winter itself. The Finns had turned their inhospitable homeland into an insurmountable fortress, and the true cost of breaching it would be measured not just in casualties, but in the psychological collapse of an army pitted against nature's fury.
The Red Army, blinded by numerical superiority and a rigid adherence to doctrine, moved with predictable, ponderous columns along the few cleared forest roads. This tactical vulnerability, born of logistical necessity in the harsh Finnish landscape, was precisely what the Finns had anticipated and meticulously prepared to exploit. Their answer was not a direct confrontation, but a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, the Madi tactic. Derived from the Finnish word for a bundle of firewood, it was a chillingly apt descriptor for the fate awaiting Soviet units. Finnish ski troops, operating with an almost supernatural agility through the snow-laden forests, would ambush these extended Soviet columns. Their initial strikes were surgically precise, focusing on the vanguard and rear elements simultaneously. This immediate disruption severed command and control, and, crucially, choked off the vital supply arteries. Once the column was fragmented, these smaller, highly mobile units would then encircle segments of the Soviet force, effectively chopping the long log of men and material into isolated, smaller Madis. Trapped within these increasingly desperate pockets, the Soviet soldiers faced an enemy far more insidious than the Finnish rifle, the brutal Finnish winter itself. Temperatures plummeting to -40 degrees Celsius, dwindling food and fuel supplies, and the constant, unseen menace of Finnish snipers and patrols turned these encirclements into cauldrons of psychological and physical torment. Units that had boasted overwhelming firepower found themselves starved, frozen, and demoralized, their heavy equipment rendered immobile and useless in the deep snow. The very concept of a unified command dissolved into isolated pockets of despair. The Finns, numerically inferior but tactically brilliant, would then systematically reduce these Madis. They employed hit-and-run raids, night attacks, and constant harassment, denying the encircled Soviets any rest or opportunity to consolidate. The sound of a ski patrol moving through the trees or the crack of a Finnish rifle from an unseen position became a potent instrument of psychological warfare, slowly eroding the will to resist. This ingenious strategy allowed a small nation of resilient defenders to not merely hold their ground, but to annihilate entire divisions of a global superpower, transforming the battlefield into a graveyard of Soviet arrogance and rigid military doctrine. The strategic ingenuity of the Finns, however, extended far beyond the Madi tactics, infiltrating the very psyche of the invading force. While vast columns of Red Army soldiers stumbled through the snow-choked forests, their movements observed from the shadows, an altogether more insidious threat began to manifest. This was the era of the Finnish sniper, a lone wolf operating with chilling efficiency, who would soon etch a new, terrifying legend into the annals of winter warfare. It was in these frozen wildernesses that the true embodiment of the White Death was born. The Finnish sniper was not merely a marksman, he was an extension of the land itself. Clad in simple yet supremely effective white camouflage, these silent killers were virtually indistinguishable from the snow-laden drifts and frosted branches around them. Their understanding of the terrain was absolute, an intimate knowledge forged from generations of hunting and survival in this unforgiving environment. Every tree, every rock, every undulation in the snow became a potential firing position, a hidden sanctuary from which to unleash a single, devastating shot. These sharpshooters moved with a spectral silence, their footsteps muffled by thick snow or expertly placed to avoid detection. They could remain motionless for hours in temperatures plummeting to -40 degrees Celsius, their breath carefully managed to avoid telltale plumes in the frigid air. Their targets were seldom random. Officers, machine gunners, radio operators, the very nerve centers of Soviet command and communication. A single well-placed round could decapitate a squad, sever a crucial communication link, or silence a heavy weapon, sending ripples of disorganization and panic through the ranks. For the Red Army soldier, this unseen enemy became an omnipresent terror. The biting wind carried not just the scent of pine and ice, but the chilling possibility of a bullet finding its mark from an unknown direction. Each crunch of snow, each rustle in the trees, each moment of silence was pregnant with dread. "We never saw them," one captured Soviet soldier recounted, his voice thick with fear. "Only the flashes, and then a man would fall. It was like fighting ghosts." This psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective. While statistics vary, it is estimated that Finnish snipers accounted for a significant percentage of Soviet casualties, with some individual marksmen accumulating hundreds of confirmed kills. More critical than the raw numbers, however, was the profound erosion of morale. Soldiers became paranoid, hesitant to move, and increasingly unwilling to follow orders that might expose them. The very act of gathering around a campfire or even simply standing upright became a death sentence. The legend of the White Death spread like wildfire through Soviet lines, transforming a highly skilled adversary into an almost supernatural entity, a silent reaper haunting their every step. This invisible scythe of death carved deeper than any artillery barrage, turning the vast, disciplined Red Army into a collection of terrified individuals constantly glancing over their shoulders, waiting for the unseen bullet. As the casualty count mounted and the freezing forests claimed more and more Soviet lives, an insidious enemy, far more potent than Finnish bullets, began to corrode the Red Army from within, the specter of the White Death. What started as isolated incidents of terror quickly metastasized into a profound psychological collapse, gripping the entire invading force in the clutches of paranoia. The sheer brutality of the Finnish winter, coupled with the invisible, relentless precision of snipers like Simo Häyhä, shattered the carefully cultivated Soviet image of invincibility. Soldiers, once confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of snow and shadow, where every rustle of the wind, every creak of a frozen branch became a potential harbinger of death. The absence of a discernible enemy was, paradoxically, more terrifying than any frontal assault. A captured Soviet diary entry, dated early February, chillingly articulated this dread. "We see no one, yet men fall daily. The forest is alive with unseen eyes. It is not the cold that kills us, but the fear of the silence." This pervasive, gnawing anxiety eroded discipline and fostered a profound sense of helplessness. Patrols, once routine, became desperate ventures into a hostile, silent world. Commanders reported instances of men breaking ranks, abandoning positions, or suffering complete mental breakdowns under the strain of constant vigilance. The very act of gathering around a campfire or even simply standing upright became a death sentence. The legend of the White Death spread like wildfire through Soviet lines, transforming a highly skilled adversary into an almost supernatural entity, a silent reaper haunting their every step. This invisible scythe of death carved deeper than any artillery barrage, turning the vast, disciplined Red Army into a collection of terrified individuals constantly glancing over their shoulders, waiting for the unseen bullet. As the casualty count mounted and the freezing forests claimed more and more Soviet lives, an insidious enemy, far more potent than Finnish bullets, began to corrode the Red Army from within, the specter of the White Death. What started as isolated incidents of terror quickly metastasized into a profound psychological collapse, gripping the entire invading force in the clutches of paranoia. The sheer brutality of the Finnish winter, coupled with the invisible, relentless precision of snipers like Simo Häyhä, shattered the carefully cultivated Soviet image of invincibility. Soldiers, once confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of snow and shadow, where every rustle of the wind, every creak of a frozen branch became a potential harbinger of death. The absence of a discernible enemy was, paradoxically, more terrifying than any frontal assault. A captured Soviet diary entry, dated early February, chillingly articulated this dread. "We see no one, yet men fall daily. The forest is alive with unseen eyes. It is not the cold that kills us, but the fear of the silence." This pervasive, gnawing anxiety eroded discipline and fostered a profound sense of helplessness. Patrols, once routine, became desperate ventures into a hostile, silent world. Commanders reported instances of men breaking ranks, abandoning positions, or suffering complete mental breakdowns under the strain of constant vigilance.
The psychological toll manifested in myriad ways. Reports from the front lines spoke of soldiers experiencing vivid hallucinations, convinced they saw white ghosts flitting through the snow-laden trees, the spectral embodiment of the unseen Finnish marksmen. These weren't just snipers, they were perceived as supernatural entities, silent reapers of souls. Another poignant entry, attributed to a Soviet political commissar,
painted a grim picture. Morale is at its lowest. Men refuse to leave their trenches. They speak of shadows moving on their own, of eyes watching from every snowdrift. We tell them it is propaganda, but their terror is real. The White Death has claimed more minds than bodies. The once unbreakable resolve of the Red Army began to fracture under this sustained, invisible psychological assault. The very environment, initially seen as merely a logistical challenge, had become an accomplice to the Finnish resistance, amplifying the terror and deepening the despair. Every shadow, every distant tree line transformed into a potential sniper's nest, turning the vast, desolate landscape into a claustrophobic cage of dread. The pervasive terror, however, was not merely a psychological weapon. It was a tactical conundrum that demanded a response from the Soviet high command. The Red Army, accustomed to overwhelming numerical and material superiority, found itself battling an invisible enemy that defied conventional engagement. Their initial arrogance quickly gave way to a chilling frustration, culminating in a series of desperate yet largely futile measures. One of the most devastating and simultaneously least effective Soviet countermeasures was the adoption of square removal bombardments. Whole grid squares on a map, suspected of harboring Finnish resistance, would be systematically deluged with indiscriminate artillery fire. Massive concentrations of howitzers, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers would unleash an inferno of steel and high explosives, turning vast swaths of forest into splintered wasteland. The ground would churn, trees would explode into shrapnel, and snow would vaporize into violent steam. Yet, against the highly mobile and dispersed Finnish forces, particularly the elusive snipers operating in small autonomous units, these barrages were often nothing more than a spectacular waste of ordnance. The Finns, masters of camouflage and terrain, would melt into the frozen landscape, only to reappear once the shelling ceased, continuing their deadly work with chilling efficiency. The roar of Soviet artillery, intended to instill terror, instead often served as a grim reminder of their enemy's inability to pin them down. Concurrently, the Soviets deployed specialized counter-sniper teams, often referred to by the Finns as kukushka or cuckoo hunters. These units were composed of their own trained marksmen, tasked with the perilous mission of locating and eliminating the Finnish ghosts. Their tactics often involved meticulous observation, attempting to identify the subtle signs of a sniper's nest: a wisp of breath, a glint of metal, an unnatural break in the snow. Some even resorted to crude baiting, hoping to draw fire and reveal a sniper's position. However, the Finnish snipers, intimately familiar with their environment and employing ingenious tactics like using snow as a muzzle flash suppressor or burying themselves in the snow to hide their breath, proved exceptionally difficult to counter. Often, the kukushka teams found themselves becoming the hunted, picked off one by the very specters they pursued, their missions ending in quiet, bloody failure that only amplified the psychological dread within the Red Army.
Even attempts at psychological warfare proved laughably ineffective. Soviet propaganda, broadcast through loudspeakers or scattered via leaflets, promised the Finns a swift end to hostilities if they surrendered, or threatened them with annihilation if they continued their futile resistance. Such rhetoric, however, entirely failed to grasp the indomitable Sisu, the Finnish spirit of extraordinary grit, resilience, and stubborn determination that permeated every soldier. These pronouncements were met with either stony silence or derisive laughter, serving only to underscore the Soviet Union's profound misunderstanding of their opponent's will and their own tactical impotence in the face of such resolve. The rigid adherence to conventional military doctrine, coupled with an inability to adapt to the brutal realities of winter warfare and the cunning of the Finnish defense, meant that the Red Army's desperate measures only deepened their operational paralysis and the gnawing fear that haunted their ranks. While the collective terror of the White Death gripped the Red Army, no single figure better encapsulated this chilling phenomenon than Simo Häyhä. He was not a product of elite military academies or a specialist in advanced weaponry. Häyhä was a Finnish farmer, a man whose intimate knowledge of the snow-laden forests transformed him into an apex predator. His confirmed kill count, an astounding 505 Soviet soldiers in less than 100 days of combat,
remains an unparalleled record in the annals of sniper warfare. This unprecedented lethality was not born of advanced technology, but rather a mastery of his environment and a series of deceptively simple yet utterly devastating techniques. Firstly, Haya famously refused to use a telescopic sight on his M2830 rifle. While counterintuitive to modern sharpshooters, this decision eliminated the telltale glare that could betray a sniper's position. It also allowed him to maintain a lower profile, presenting a smaller target, and offered a wider field of view in the dense, snow-covered terrain. His unwavering accuracy with iron sights was a testament to his profound skill. Secondly, Haya would pack snow into his mouth before engaging a target. This seemingly innocuous act was a stroke of genius in the sub-zero temperatures. It prevented his breath from condensing into visible vapor, a fatal error for any sniper attempting to remain concealed in the frigid air. Lastly, he often constructed small snow berms or ice shields in front of his position. These simple fortifications served multiple purposes. They obscured his position from enemy observation, provided a degree of cover against return fire, and, crucially, helped to absorb the subtle muzzle flash and dust kick-up that could reveal a sniper's location to a watchful adversary. Each technique, a testament to Finnish ingenuity and practical adaptation, contributed to his devastating effectiveness. For the Red Army, Haya was not merely a sniper. He was a ghost, a myth, an invisible force that picked them off with terrifying precision. His legend amplified the psychological impact of the White Death, turning every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a rifle, into a harbinger of doom. He was the ultimate illustration of how individual skill, combined with environmental mastery, could wield a psychological weapon potent enough to break the morale of an entire invading army. Yet to reduce the terror inflicted upon the Red Army solely to the glint of a sniper's scope or the silent crack of Haya's rifle would be to fundamentally misunderstand the multifaceted horror of the Winter War. Simo Haya was indeed a devastating individual weapon, a master of his frigid domain, but he was also a chilling symbol, an embodiment of a far grander, more insidious arsenal, the Finnish environment itself, meticulously weaponized by cunning tactics.
Beyond the bullet, a trinity of silent killers stalked the Soviet ranks: the unrelenting cold, the gnawing hunger, and the soul-crushing isolation. Temperatures frequently plunged to -40°C, often lower, transforming every breath into a visible plume of vapor and every exposed inch of skin into a canvas for the brutal artistry of frostbite. Limbs became numb, then useless, then necrotic, requiring amputation in crude, desperate conditions, or simply rotting on the living body. Motors seized, lubricants congealed, and even the most robust machinery groaned under the strain, rendering mechanized columns vulnerable, if not entirely immobile. The Finns, masters of mobile warfare in their own terrain, exploited this environmental brutality with devastating precision through their Mahdi tactics. These weren't grand, sweeping maneuvers, but rather surgical strikes. Small, agile Finnish ski patrols would ambush Soviet columns, not necessarily to annihilate them outright, but to sever their logistical arteries, creating isolated pockets, the Mahdis, of increasingly desperate Soviet troops. Once encircled, these units became living, suffering targets. Food supplies dwindled, then vanished. The promise of hot meals, once a distant memory, became a cruel joke. Soldiers, already weakened by the cold, resorted to eating shoe leather, bark from pine trees, and even the flesh of fallen horses. Starvation, a slow, inexorable embrace of death, systematically eroded their strength, their discipline, and ultimately their will to fight. Compounding this physical torment was the profound psychological toll of isolation. Trapped in a frozen wilderness, surrounded by an unseen enemy, the Soviet soldiers endured a living nightmare of paranoia and despair. The constant threat of a sniper's bullet, the fear of a sudden ski patrol raid, and the agonizing realization that rescue was a distant fantasy broke even the most hardened men. Morale evaporated, replaced by a brooding, fatalistic resignation.
The Red Army was not merely fighting the Finnish army. It was locked in a desperate, losing battle against the very elements, against the terrain, and against the crushing weight of its own strategic blunders, all masterfully orchestrated by a smaller, more adaptable adversary. The brutal calculus of war, however, cares little for individual heroism or national Sisu when confronted by overwhelming numerical superiority. Despite the astonishing tenacity of the Finnish defense and the terror wrought by figures like Simo Heiha, the Red Army's relentless, if often clumsy, eventually began to grind down the smaller nation. On March 13, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, bringing the Winter War to a close. Finland was forced to cede significant territory, including the strategic Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, and parts of its northern and eastern provinces, amounting to roughly 11% of its landmass and 30% of its economic assets. The Soviet Union, on paper, had achieved its territorial objectives. Yet, the cost of this victory was staggering. While official Soviet figures remained notoriously understated, Western estimates place Red Army casualties at a minimum of 380,000 to 400,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Some historians argue the true figure approached 500,000. For every Finnish soldier lost, the Soviets suffered 5 to 10. These were not mere statistics. They represented a catastrophic hemorrhage of manpower, a chilling testament to the brutal inefficiency and tactical ineptitude that plagued the Soviet war machine. Vast columns of men and material had been sacrificed on the unforgiving altar of the Finnish winter, their bodies often frozen solid, testament to a logistical nightmare and an almost suicidal disregard for human life.
Beyond the rivers of blood, the Red Army suffered a profound and undeniable humiliation on the world stage. The international community, initially expecting a swift Soviet triumph, watched in astonished disbelief as the mighty Goliath stumbled and bled against the vastly outnumbered David. The Soviet Union's prestige plummeted, its military capability questioned by every major power. For Joseph Stalin, this was a bitter pill. The purges of the late 1930s, which had decimated the Red Army's officer corps, were now glaringly exposed as a strategic blunder of epic proportions. Many of the most experienced and innovative commanders had been executed or imprisoned, replaced by politically loyal but often militarily incompetent officers. The war laid bare deep-seated weaknesses, both tactical and psychological. The Red Army's rigid command structure, its inability to adapt to the fluid, asymmetric warfare of the Finnish forests, and its catastrophic logistical failures in extreme weather conditions were all brutally evident. Its reliance on human wave attacks against entrenched positions and its initial lack of specialized winter combat equipment proved disastrous. Psychologically, the terror of the White Death, the unseen enemy that stalked their ranks, left an indelible scar. The psychological toll of an invisible, relentless adversary, coupled with the brutal cold and the constant threat of ambush, shattered morale and fostered widespread dread. This humiliating performance became a chilling object lesson for military strategists across Europe, particularly for one Adolf Hitler. The ignominious performance of the Red Army in Finland, a brutal education in winter warfare, and the psychological cost of an unseen enemy was not lost on the keenest strategic minds of Europe. Among them, Adolf Hitler, the architect of the Third Reich, observed with a mixture of contempt and catastrophic miscalculation. He witnessed the staggering casualties, the logistical quagmires, and the crushing psychological impact the White Death inflicted upon Soviet divisions. Hitler, already deeply entrenched in his racial supremacist ideologies, interpreted these failings not as temporary operational deficiencies or the unpreparedness of an army undergoing a brutal purge, but as irrefutable proof of inherent Slavic inferiority. To him, the Red Army was a lumbering, tactically inept behemoth, utterly brittle under pressure. This fatal misreading of Soviet capabilities would become a cornerstone of his most audacious gamble. The struggles in Finland convinced Hitler that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse like a house of cards once struck.
It bolstered his conviction that a lightning blitzkrieg could swiftly dismantle the vast Soviet state, securing Lebensraum and natural resources for the Third Reich. This profound underestimation directly precipitated the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, an invasion of unprecedented scale and ferocity. The strategic reverberations of the White Death thus extended far beyond the frozen forests of Finland. Hitler's flawed assessment, ironically, fueled by the very tenacity of the outnumbered Finns, condemned millions to the hellscape of the Eastern Front. The initial Soviet retreats, while devastating, ultimately gave way to a ferocious, attritional defense that defied all of Hitler's assumptions. The Red Army, though battered, proved capable of astonishing resilience, industrial adaptation, and a grim determination that would eventually break the Wehrmacht.
In a tragic twist of historical irony, the small, desperate Winter War, fought by a nation battling for its very existence, inadvertently helped to embolden a far greater conflict, sealing the fate of untold millions. The White Death in Finland, while a localized terror, cast a long, dark shadow that stretched across the European continent, influencing a strategic decision that would reshape the world and stand as one of the most catastrophic military miscalculations in human history.